If it's okay with you, we'll skip that first verse, the weird one, about Moses lifting the serpent in the wilderness. We'll come back to that in 3 years. We're also going to skip the famous one, the one that we all know so well it only takes a placard with the numbers 316 held up at a football game to call to our mind. And we're going to move a few verses down to that image, that great image that is the real gift of the Gospel of John to the church, this image of light and dark. We're first introduced to this image in the first chapter of the Gospel of John when it says Jesus is the light who has come into the world, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. It's the chapter we read on Christmas Eve. And it's the image we all have in mind as we, near the end of that service, raise those candles into the air, into the darkness of this sanctuary. Now, to be brutally honest, I'll let you know it's not actually the image I'm thinking of when we're doing that. What I'm thinking of is how we're almost to the end of Silent Night and the light has not gotten to the balcony yet, and how disappointed they're going to be when the song is over and they haven't raised their candles in the air. That's what I'm thinking of. And I think if we continue to be honest, we'll know that a lot of you aren't thinking of that image either, especially if you brought children with you or you're sitting near children, because you're thinking about how you can keep them from burning the place down, or spilling hot wax on their little sister, or spilling wax on the pews or the carpet. But for those of you who are not near or have brought children with you, and are not watching the people in the balcony, or thinking about the ham you have in the oven, or whether you can get out of here in time to get a good seat at the Duke Chapel, you might be thinking about this image as you raise your candle in the darkness of the sanctuary, that the light has come into the world and the darkness cannot overcome it. Well, now, 3.5 months later and 2 chapters later, we get the image again. And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and the people loved darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light and do not come to the light, so that their deeds may not be exposed. But those who do what is true come to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that their deeds have been done in God. A stark contrast. Light, dark. Either your deeds are evil and you love darkness, or you love the light and you live in God. Either or, this or that, you choose. I had an experience last week that made me see this image a little bit differently and raise some questions for me about it. You know, our time changed last weekend. We went from standard time to daylight savings time, and it's usually my job in the evening to put our 2.5-year-old daughter, Mary Claire, to bed. So at 7 o'clock on Sunday night, the day the time changed because that's her bedtime, I got her ready for bed and I took her to her room, and it was bright in there. And she wasn't tired yet because she thought it was just 6 o'clock. So we went back downstairs and we played for a half an hour or 40 minutes. And this time when I went up there, I noticed that it was different. It wasn't dark like it had been the week earlier at her bedtime, but it also wasn't bright light like it was just 40 minutes earlier. It was somehow in between. Her room was gray. I could still find my way around in it, and she could still see a little bit her snuggle bear there in the front of her face. But it wasn't bright like it had been earlier, and it wasn't dark like it was last week. It was gray. It was in between. And the next morning, I came to the office, and I opened this passage from the Gospel of John, and I read it to myself, and I thought, But what about the in-between? What about that place where the light meets the darkness and they blend and it's kind of gray like it was for some of us this morning when we were driving for church? Because let's be honest, most of us don't live our lives in the deep darkness of evil midnight. But we also don't live our lives all the time in the bright light of midday, right? But most of us live our lives somewhere in between. We're not reveling in the evil deeds of darkness, but we're not also blinding our neighbors with our sunlight saintliness. Isn't it true that most of us are living in that dusk light or that dawn light, that place where the light and the darkness meet and mingle? Isn't that where most of us are living? Now, that's not to say that the idea that we can clearly delineate the light from the darkness and maybe that it's our job to do so is not still popular. There certainly are those who think that they have a sole possession of the light and are called to let all the rest of us know how we are living in the darkness. On February the 29th, in Harrisburg, Illinois, early in the morning, an F4 tornado ripped through the town and killed 6 people. In the days of the aftermath, those Christians from Westboro Baptist Church in Kansas announced that they were going to bring their traveling protest to Harrisburg, Illinois, and were going to protest at the funerals of these 6 tornado victims. They were going to do it because, as they said, they needed to call attention to the fact that these 6 had died for the sins of Illinois. Apparently, they had missed what Faith just told us, that Jesus actually had died for the sins of Illinois and for the sins of the rest of us and for their own sins. But some of us still think that it is easy to tell the light from the darkness, and it's our job to do it. A couple of years ago, I made the mistake, you might remember, of mentioning the conversion to Christianity of a famous novelist named Anne Rice, who had written a long series of vampire novels. She had recently written a beautiful memoir. I think it had something about light and darkness in the title, about how she had lived so long in the darkness thinking about these vampires, creatures of the night, but had come to the light and had turned to the beauty of the church and was now a Christian. And I held her up as an example of someone who had come to the light. And then last July, Anne Rice announced on Facebook that she had, deconverted. Here's what she wrote in her Facebook post, short and to the point. Today, I quit being a Christian. I'm out. I remain committed to Christ as always, but not to being a Christian or being a part of Christianity. I refuse, she said, to be anti-feminist. I refuse to be anti-artificial birth control. I refuse to be anti-democrat. I refuse to be anti-secular humanism. I refuse to be anti-science. I refuse to be anti-life. In the name of Christ, I quit Christianity and being a Christian. Amen. And Rice is only one of a very large population of people who are leaving churches that think they have sole possession of the light and know who live in the darkness and define themselves by what they are against. I suspect that Anne Rice just had too many friends or people she loved who lived on what her church called the wrong side or in the darkness, and she simply knew better. Clear cut, light dark. I was in a group of pastors about 6 years ago when we were writing our ordination papers. And we were being guided through this process by an older pastor in the conference. She was a second career pastor, but she'd written her papers long before, and she was reading them and giving us feedback. And I remember one day she responded to the papers of one of the pastors in the group, responded to something he had said in his papers about divorce. She said to him that she thought he could tone it down a little bit. It seemed a little too black and white, maybe uncharitable. And he said, well, we know God hates divorce, and I'm only telling the truth. And I was delighted that she said in her ironic way, well, I disagree with that. Though it was the most painful time of my own life, when I chose to divorce my husband years ago, it was one of the rightest choices I've ever made. And I don't think God hated it or me because of it. Black, white, clear cut, in or out. Adam Hamilton is the pastor of the largest United Methodist church in this country. And several years ago, he preached a sermon series called Seeing Gray in a World of Black and White. They published it as a book. Some of you have read it in a small group here at the church. And a year and a half ago, he was speaking at a conference I was attending, and he told us that after he preached one of those sermons, he didn't say which one, but we could probably, if we use our imaginations, guess what it was about. After he had preached one of those sermons, in the weeks following, 700 people left his church. 700. Some of us need it to be absolutely clear. Light, dark, good, bad, in, out, and need our churches to tell us. But I admired Hamilton's willingness and his courage to say, even if it cost his church members, that it's not all light over here where we are and darkness over here where they are, but there is this place in between where the light and the darkness meet, and that's where most of us live. That's really not so different from what we encounter here in the Gospel of John. Even though light and dark seem like such stark contrasts, there is a key truth in this passage that it's easy for us to forget. We are often tempted to think that we ourselves are the light. But the whole point of the Gospel of John is that Jesus is the light who has come into the world. It's not about figuring out who is in the darkness and who is in the light. And if there is any light shining from us or any light shining from our church, if we are able to inch forward at all, not obscured by our own sin or our own darkness, it's because the light of Jesus is shining on us, not because we own the light ourselves. Rather than an invitation to figure out who is in the light and who is in the darkness, this passage is an invitation for all of us to move a little closer to the light of Jesus. It's an acknowledgement that the darkness, what the Gospel of John calls the world, the darkness runs right through the middle of each one of us, even if we don't recognize it. Perhaps especially if we don't recognize it. But that Jesus, nonetheless, shines in that darkness, and that darkness cannot overcome it. Now, I experience that as profoundly good news, because I'm at least a little bit aware of some of the darkness in my own life. And I suspect a number of you experience that as good news as well. It's a good chance that some of you are here because you grew up in a church or went to a church at one point in your life that knew they owned the light and were clear about who was in the darkness, and somewhere along the way, you inched toward what they called the darkness, and you knew you no longer belonged, or they let you know. Or maybe you're here because you find that the worship and the community and the fellowship in your small groups, it helps you move a little closer to the light. You're aware of the darkness in your own life, perhaps all too aware. Aware enough to know that you have no business judging others. Aware enough to know that you are not the sole possessor of the light. But also thankful that the light is shining in your darkness. It's a light that has admittedly not yet vanquished the darkness once and for all. That's why we can still recognize it in ourselves and in others and in the world. But it's a light that cannot be conquered by that darkness. Being or becoming a Christian does not mean that there is a moment when you moved from the darkness once and for all and stepped over a line into the bright light of midday and lived there all the time. It means you're on a journey, moving a little closer, that you have seen it or you have glimpsed the light and you're moving toward it, that you've seen the light of Jesus rising like the dawn, and you've experienced it pushing back the darkness in your own life, and you want to get a little closer. You want to come to that light and move in that direction, slowly and patiently. That's what the church is. It's the company of people who have glimpsed that light and want to move toward it. Patiently, often stumblingly, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but closer to the light and inviting others to come along. All the while giving thanks that the darkness in us is not stronger than this light. The darkness thought it was once. Once the darkness thought it was stronger than the light. On a Friday afternoon, a very long time ago, when the light of the world was nailed to a tree, the darkness thought it was stronger than the light. The darkness was wrong. Amen.